find our podcast here on the John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel, through our website and our social media. So without further ado, we'll jump in and joined by Rob, one of our board members here. Rob, you want to introduce yourself and say hi to the folks?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for allowing me to join you today, Josh. It's great, and I think we have a really interesting guest. So rather than me talk about me, let's get right into
it. Agreed. As always, Josh Constantinou, Coordinated Access Coordinator. But let's turn it over to Dr. Baz for an introduction and see how things are going.
Hi, thanks for having me. So yes, I am Baz. I am a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I founded John Jay's Prison to College Pipeline program 14 years ago, and I am the founder and executive director of Incarceration Nations Network, which is a global prison reform organization. So thanks for having me.
Yes, thanks for joining us. Rob and I were talking before we jumped on, and we each spent some time kind of going through the website and a couple of your videos and some of the work, and you've been up to some really great, impressive stuff. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole on that, for our listeners, we thought maybe we could just start by telling us a bit about what the Incarceration Nation Network is and what you do.
Sure. So we are a network of partners, 135 partner organizations in more than 4 countries, doing a host of, broadly speaking, prison reform work. So everything from reintegration work, policy and advocacy work, work in education and prisons, restorative justice. And we work to connect our partners with each other and with the world and really build broad, global, transnational coalition in terms of doing this work. That's who we are. We have a number of projects, most of them being transnational in nature. And I can talk in more detail about those various projects, but I would say that our two sort of areas of focus are, number one, culture and narrative change, where we use various creative means to shift the narrative about crime, safety, punishment, prisons, really pushing for a smart on crime rather than tough on crime approach to justice and to safety. And then our other area of expertise is leadership support for those with lived experience. So nurturing and supporting the leadership of those with lived experience of the justice system and ensuring that they are leading the way and supported to lead the way. I would also say that under that heading, which is kind of its own area of focus for us, is our education, not incarceration mantra, where we work very hard to build prison university partnerships around the world, similar to the Prison to College Pipeline, which I built in New York. And also to support university students, both in prison and coming home from prison. So that's us in a nutshell.
That's a heck of a nutshell. Lots going on, lots of places we could go. I will say the, smart on crime, not tough on crime. I like that. I like that as a slogan. We had a bit of a discussion about that on Monday's episode as well, and how the research says that the tough on crime doesn't yield better results, which I'm sure you could speak to and are well aware of.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's important to recognize, too, in the same vein, that the war on doesn't work either. So when we talk about the war on drugs, frankly, the war on virus, like these are not tenable approaches, that we really need to be smart on crime, smart on substance use, smart on epidemics and pandemics, rather than, this idea of a war on.
For sure. Yeah. And so maybe take us back. We were going to start with the Incarceration Nations Network, but I'm curious about the pipeline that you mentioned that you started in New York there. If you could talk a little bit about that and how that came to be.
Sure. Yeah. So I started working in prisons just about 20 years ago as a volunteer and in an educational capacity in the New York State prison system, after I started receiving a lot of letters from people in prison who had read my work. And I want to give a shout out to Manuel Lugo, who unfortunately is still incarcerated on his 4th decade of incarceration. And he invited me to prison as part of an organization that he was heading from the inside. He's He's the reason I do what I do today, because he wrote to me and invited me in as a volunteer. And ultimately, I got asked at that time, was settling into John Jay, and I got asked why we don't have a prison program, an education program in any prison. And I said, well, I don't know. And so I went to the president alongside a wonderful colleague, Debbie Mukamal, and we said, why don't we start something? And we did. So ultimately, it became the Prison to College Pipeline. And the idea was that it was really set out to be the first university program, college program inside prison with reintegration, designed with reintegration in mind, so that people were able to study on the inside and also be pipelined into the university system when they're released, so that they're able to take advantage of all of the matrix of services and networks and all of the good stuff that comes with going to university on the outside. So it was a sort of best of both worlds approach. And 14 years later, I have passed the torch some years ago in order to launch INN, Incarceration Nations Network, but it is still doing its thing. There are many, many illustrious graduates who are now actually, many of them, doing wonderful work in the justice space and in other spaces in New York and throughout the U.S. So it's a program that really shaped how I do the work. I obviously really believe in the power of education to change lives and particularly to impact people in the context of incarceration. And I should add that the Prison to College Pipeline now offers degrees on the inside as well. So you can have the pipeline option, and you can do the degree inside. The name, of course, is a reversal of what is widely known as the school to prison pipeline, the ways in which young people, Black and brown young people throughout the US and frankly the world, are criminalized from a young age and pipelined into the prison system from schools. So the idea of the program was to say we're reversing that flow. So it was a very deliberate nod to this phenomenon.
So higher education within prison must have a significant impact to prevent people from reoffending. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it has an impact even beyond that. I think too often we limit it to this talk about, it lowers recidivism rates. Like, that's sort of the least of what it does. What it does is really create opportunities that people should have had in the first place. Or else if they had them, they probably would not have gone to prison, right? It creates new identities for people, new conceptions of themselves as citizens, as people in the world, as men and women, as mothers and fathers. So it's really identity shifting thing that goes well beyond recidivism rates and also goes beyond, simply obtaining a degree and a credential. I think I think about the Prison to College Pipeline, and there are many students who did not end up getting a degree. They, accrued a number of credits, but the program still was enormously impactful on their sense of self, their sense of agency, their sense of possibility and opportunity in the world. So and yes, of course, we know that it also reduces recidivism, but it's so much deeper than that.
It must also have a positive effect on their family members. If you can see one of your parents going through university or a college education, you're more inclined to pursue it yourself.
Absolutely. And actually, we've had a number of students kind of go through the process on the inside alongside their children or family members on the outside. Manuel, who I just mentioned, actually studied at Cornell, at the Cornell program in prison, and his son studied at Cornell on the outside at the same time. So it's a really powerful motivation and inspiration.
That's really neat.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So shifting then to, you said, you sort of passed that torch to start INN. How did that come about and get started?
So I was awarded a global Fulbright fellowship, which was a really wonderful opportunity to sort of step back and think about incarceration in the world. This came about after I wrote my book, Incarceration Nations. I became very interested in understanding mass incarceration, not just in the U.S. but in the world, and also understanding the U.S.'s role in impacting and shaping mass incarceration around the world. And so I spent several years traveling to prisons in different countries, wrote a book about it, and it came out in 2016. And following that, I had a fellowship, a Fulbright fellowship, that allowed me to spend some time in Chile, South Africa, and Rwanda. Places where I'd been to South Africa for the book before, I'd been to Rwanda for the book, Chile was new to me. And ultimately I came to realize that there were, in all of these countries all over the world, there were people doing some aspect of this work to end mass incarceration and move us past a prison-based system of justice. But they were doing it so disconnected to each other, so, often on a shoestring budget. There was no real movement anywhere. And so it became clear to me that we needed a global movement, and we needed to connect the dots across the world so that people could learn from each other and benefit from each other. And so I started INN by literally just hunting down organizations all over the world, connecting with them on Zoom. Ultimately, as I got funding support to build the network, I was able to visit multiple countries and meet these partners in person and see their work on the ground. And then INN grew out of that.
Wow. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to talk a little bit about around the world, incarceration for minor offenses, and how the organizations that you partner with, are they making a positive impact to get governments to change policies?
Some are, it's a big world, and I can say this, that broadly speaking, prison is not popular. In the US, I was part of the larger movement that made prison more of a front and center item. Obviously, we still have loads of work to do here in the US as the world's second largest incarcerator. El Salvador actually overtook us as of last year. This is per capita I'm talking. But in the last, I'd say 5 to 8 years, this has really become a front and center and a fundable issue, most critically here in the US. Outside of the US, it is not fundable, it is not popular, with a few exceptions here and there of countries. So overwhelmingly, our partner organizations are working against a great hurdle of the challenge of getting funding, the challenge of getting public buy-in for this. People just want to lock people up and throw away the key throughout the world. So many of our partners are indeed fighting things like petty offenses, old colonial offenses. In the US, we call them misdemeanors, but in the global South, impacted by colonialism, there are these petty offenses, things like loitering, loud noises, things of that nature. So that's definitely one of the pieces of the fight. The war on drugs is hugely impactful in the world. And again, that's like prison itself. That's a US export. We have heavily pushed the war on drugs throughout the world. So that's another big fight for our partners. And then I would just add that reintegration, people coming home from prison and struggling to find work, to find housing, being legally discriminated against in the search for jobs because of their convictions, is a tremendously important and sizable issue. And probably in the terms of the categories of the different things that our partner organizations do, reintegration is the biggest one, because it is very much a nightmare that looks similar from country to country.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned about the reintegration piece. We had some research out of another John Howard branch in Ontario around employers hiring people with criminal record checks and what that looked like. And a lot of what they found was that the more employers knew about the offenses and some of the details of it and how outdated some of them were, the more inclined they were to actually consider some of these folks. which is
Yeah,
positive in some sense, but probably speaks to the, like you said, sort of legal discrimination that's going on that we even have to get to that point.
exactly. I mean, I think, you know, we are throughout the world, you're able to legally discriminate against people with convictions in ways that you cannot against people around things like gender, sexuality, race, etc. And, you know, a person's conviction is not the point. And it certainly isn't the point, like right up front in the hiring process. Maybe for certain professions down the line, but it's an immediate barrier to people all over the world.
And have you seen an ability to make any headway in any of the countries, either local or around the world, in terms of that?
Well, yes, I'd like to think that, you know, we've been in existence for 5 years now. I'd like to think we've seen impact. I think I mentioned culture change is a big area for us. And I think what I've come to see, and one of the great lessons in the first 5 years of INN is that, as I often say, culture eats policy for breakfast. That, in fact, policy doesn't change unless culture changes, because people, you know, politicians are subject to the whims and the desires of the people. And if people are screaming for prison because they think prison makes them safe, or they're screaming for discriminatory hiring practices because they think it makes us safe, then that's what the policymakers are going to go after, and that's what they're going to push. But if the people are educated from the bottom up, then there is, you know, a change has to happen. And so actually, I think certainly it's important to engage with policymakers, you know, top down and bottom up, but our focus is really on the bottom up, because we want the people to understand this and start clamoring for, again, smart on crime instead of tough on crime, because that's what makes us safer. And I always center safety in this. This is not, you know, yes, there is empathy here. Yes, we care about human lives and all of that good stuff, but we're about safe communities. Everyone deserves to live in safety. As an organization, we are partly based in South Africa, and that's a country that, you know, is grappling with radical unsafety. And a large part of that is radical inequality and the over-reliance on prisons as making people safer, when in fact prisons produce more crime and create this cycle of harm. And so I think culture is tremendously important. I should also add that even when policy does change, if culture doesn't change alongside it, if the conversation, if the narrative doesn't change alongside it, then the policy doesn't get implemented right, if at all. So, and we've seen this, I've seen this happen quite a bit. So it's really, really important to reach the people and to shift the culture.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it and a great way of thinking about it. Because as you said, like ultimately, people, and generally the people that speak out are people that are, you know, against things. And so they certainly have the power to influence decision makers and influence opinions moving forward.
Yeah, and when you talk about culture change, I just finished a 40-year military career in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I watched an organization that was a misogynistic, racist organization evolve, and quite dramatically in the last 6 or 7 years. And it was because there was this force of change that happened from the top that meant that we talked about DEI and culture change and the importance of it every day for years to make that change. So I wonder, how can we do that within your system, within our system, within the criminal justice system?
Yeah, I think our answer is, I mean, I'm a creative at heart. I'm an artist. I'm a writer. I love, and technically I'm a literature professor. A lot of people don't know this about me. They think I'm a lawyer or a criminologist or a sociologist. I'm not. My background is my doctorate's in literature and African American studies, and so I think a lot about culture, and I love culture, and so. At INN, we have an art installation. It's going on 11 years now, called The Writing on the Wall. That's made of writing, drawings, poems, notes by people in prison around the world, in collaboration with Hank Willis Thomas, who's a renowned visual artist. We've staged that installation all over the world. It's actually currently up in Washington, D.C. right now. We also have a documentary series that I directed and co-produced, and it's called Incarceration Nations, a global docuseries. It's on our website and our YouTube page, available for free. Each episode actually kind of focuses on a theme within mass incarceration across borders. So there's an episode on women, an episode on education, not incarceration, and so on. We even have a musical group in Trinidad currently called Critical Mass that is created. They're a collective really, of formerly incarcerated artists that are making music and spoken word poetry about the crisis of mass incarceration. So our focus is to use culture and also to have different kinds of events that are public facing, that are friendly to all, that are not, only siloed academics and policymakers, but brings everybody across silos into the same space to have these really important conversations. So that's really important. And we created the docuseries specifically for events like that. So that organizations would have the opportunity. We did a world tour of the docuseries with our partners where we screened it in all kinds of settings. So actually, I'd encourage listeners, go on our website or go on our YouTube page and use the docuseries. They're a part of curriculums. They're a part of schools. We do a lot of work in schools, whether it's, younger, the pre-university level and university level, trying to impact the next generation, because they're the hope here, right? They're the next generation. So that's our approach to culture change.
Excellent. And then we will make sure that we include a link to your YouTube channel from our website too, so that people are able to go in and view those videos.
Great.
Yes, definitely. So in terms of that culture shift, I know, as you mentioned, criminalization and use of prisons has been kind of the popular methodology in the States, probably primarily in North America, but certainly more to a degree there. Are there other countries where they've taken a different approach, or where they already had a different approach, and kind of what does that look like?
Well, I think the usual suspect in this is Scandinavia. That's who usually gets pointed to as
Sure.
the quote unquote model. And, I always emphasize that I prefer not to think about a model country, but rather taking a global approach, which is to say that there are strong things happening in lots of places, even in places where you wouldn't expect it necessarily. And but I think overall, Norway gets pointed to quite a bit. That said, there's a lot shifting in Norway due to the rise of the foreign prison population and xenophobia. And so there's a lot about the Norwegian approach that's being challenged in the current day. But Norway, is quite famous for a few things. Norway, Finland as well. I often say Finland is a better example because Finland modeled its system after Russia for many years, and then in the early 2000s radically decided to shift its approach and follow the Scandinavian model. And so literally turned its ship around almost overnight, and against public opinion, I should say, because they knew that it was a smarter approach. And so in general, the Scandinavian countries, they use open prisons, so people can come and go. Not all of the prisons are open, but many of them are. The ones, and so that means that the individual who is incarcerated remains part of the community, even while incarcerated, and benefits from the same social services as he or she would on the outside. Which is really important. They also have a training academy. One of our partners is the Norwegian Staff Training Academy, which looks like nothing else in the world, really. To be a prison officer, there's a focus on what's called dynamic security. So not militaristic security, but rather dynamic engagement with people. So it's a very rigorous training that involves social education and social work, law, and psychology, and all of these good things. So the staff approach is very noted in the Scandinavian countries. But I should also say that I think in many ways, the main thing that we talk about in terms of justice in Scandinavia is that there is a powerful, powerful thing that is lacking in many countries, which is strong social services in the first place. And so you're going to have lower crime rates when there's better social services, more access to opportunities for all, and much less radical inequality. So that, to me, is the most important feature of the Scandinavian approach, is that more equal society overall that is going to create less crime.
And do the Scandinavian models also focus more on education again within the prison system? I think somewhere I read on your webpage that every dollar spent on education saves $5 in incarceration fees.
Yeah, there's lots of data showing us that around education. They do have a strong education system. But again, it's noteworthy that last I checked, there was about 30% of the prisons in Norway were open prisons. So people can receive education just like anyone else, right? So it's not a special prison education. When you have an open prison, people are able to leave and go to school on the outside as if, they are not incarcerated. And I think that's also a really approach. You don't see that a lot in the world. There are programs, I'll mention Italy by name, where people are able to, through some open prisons, go and study at the university on the outside. That's a really, really, I think, important approach.
Yeah, I think that would ease reintegration, because you really aren't reintegrating. You're already integrated into society.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting you talk about sort of the overarching sort of social justice or social equality that's going on in other places, and how that impacts all the other factors, whether it be, incarceration or substance use or mental health or some of the other things that we might see. And so I guess when you've said such a focus on education and culture change, what are some of the target areas or target sort of goals, if you will, that you focus on when you're engaging with other countries and other approaches there?
So I would say, certainly broadly speaking, the culture change that I was just mentioning, but also as I spoke about earlier, support for leadership of those with lived experience of the justice system. We have a program called the Global Freedom Fellowship, where we bring formerly incarcerated leaders from around the world to South Africa annually. It's actually about to kick off next week. I head to South Africa tomorrow. So this will be our third year of the fellowship. So we're actually building a whole community, a global community of formerly incarcerated people who, upon, whether in prison or coming home from prison, actually built incredible, whether it's built organizations or doing culture change work, but are doing the work to end mass incarceration in their home countries, informed by their lived experience of the criminal justice system. So our fellowship program is really a flagship program for us. And everywhere I go and we go in the world, we try to bring our fellows with us as leaders. Certainly, if we're doing an event in their home country, we count on them to lead the way. So that's a really, really important thing for us.
Yeah, I know that's important. Recently, I attended a national board meeting for the John Howard Society of Canada, and it's a room full of people who look probably very similar to me, older, middle-aged white guys. And we talk a lot, and lucky for us, there was a member from John Howard Society in Nova Scotia who had been incarcerated for a very long time. And every time we got off on a tangent, he brought us back on point and reminded us of what we were doing and how important it is. And he provided his own set of values and his lived experience, which really helped facilitate the discussion. So I think what you're doing with that is fantastic.
Well, please tell him to apply for the Global Freedom Fellowship. He sounds like a fantastic candidate. And I'll say too, speaking of Canada, the other sort of our other realm for support for leaders with lived experience is through our education, not incarceration work. We actually have something called the Global Freedom Scholars Network, which is our network of formerly incarcerated university graduates and students from around the world. And we do have a Canadian chapter of that. We have 15 chapters, so 15 countries with chapters of the Global Freedom Scholars Network. And we work to support and elevate this work globally. And so the chapters have their own activities. We also come together at transnational events. We had a big launch event last year in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where we brought the chapters from all over the world. And we're planning a couple of convenings actually in April and May, one in Mexico City, where we're bringing a number of our fellows and also our global freedom scholars there. And, you know, education, as we've talked about, is critically important in its own right. But we also see it as something that ultimately develops leaders. And I think the important thing, you know, if this isn't self-evident, I think the important thing about supporting leadership and, as we say, you know, building people, not prisons, is that it is the route to structural change. It ensures that the work keeps going after I'm gone, after we're gone. And it also really allows for, you know, the people who are going to keep creating change to flourish and be supported. And so I think at the end of the day, the even to some extent, even more than changing policy, is really giving people that platform and that leadership support. So our work, you know, in education, not incarceration, also for us falls under the heading of support for leadership of those with lived experience.
Fantastic. Is there anything else you want to talk about in our last few minutes?
No, I would just say that, well, I mean, I think it's worth we talking about the elephant in the room for a second, which is the current US administration. And, you know, I've gotten asked quite a bit about how that's impacting our work. Of course, it's impacting our work. But I think the key is recognizing that the work goes on regardless of administration. One of the lessons that I've learned in working in the Global South is that I and we at INN know what it is to do this work unsupported by government and unable to take government funds. And in most countries around the world, you don't have the privilege of taking government grants because they're often tainted. They're connected to a political party, and then you become part of that party by taking the money, and you just become subject to the politics, right? So we rarely take government money, and like I said, in much of the world, you cannot. So I think what that's taught me and what that's taught us at INN is that we know how to keep doing the work, even when, you know, we cannot rely on government. We have to work independent of government. And so we shouldn't let the current scenario, as dire as it absolutely is, really deter us from continuing to do the work.
And I think, again, when you talk about culture change, if we can do enough to affect culture change, then maybe we take the government portion of that out of the equation. And we don't have to worry about this cycle every 4 years of which way are we heading as a nation. And
Yes.
Again, I think you'll notice that as polite Canadians, we didn't mention your government, but we're thinking about it quite a bit lately.
Yes. No, I think that's really wise. I think that too often, you know, politics is such a distraction, especially presidential politics. It becomes this theater of distraction, not just in the US, but around the world. And I often say we just keep our eyes on the prize. Whoever's in power, we're working with the people, as you say, and we're trying to reach the people. And that's the most important thing.
Definitely. No, I think that's great. And I like that idea of self-sufficiency and then empowering the other people that, you know, you're connecting with and working with to become a part of the movement so that you do have that independent sustainability factor.
Exactly.
Before we wrap up, I guess a couple things we'll get through, but one I wanted to just see kind of what are the next steps or future goals for the INN as you move forward here. I know you mentioned you're jumping on a plane to Africa, so certainly that's on your mind, but what else is going on?
Yeah, so with the Global Freedom Fellowship, we are actually developing that out into a proper consulting firm, our fellows, that is. So we're going to be hopefully launching that next year. hopefully at an event, which you are both invited to. I can't say too much more about it as it's in the works, but we really want to create a platform for our fellows to be hired as consultants globally, given their lived experience and their work in the world. So basically it'll be the GFF consulting agency. We are also, through the Global Freedom Scholars Network, building out a lot more prison university partnerships around the world, including one that I'm especially excited about in South Africa. It's called Accounting for Change, and it's through the Global Freedom Scholars Network South Africa chapter, and that'll be offering a pathway into the accounting field for people in prison and coming home from prison. But we've got others in the works as well in Australia, in New Zealand. So that's really exciting because that's one of the purposes of the Global Freedom Scholars Network, is to spur more prison university partnerships around the world. And then we are also building out our outgrowth of the Writing on the Wall. That's our art project. We actually, in a pilot phase, created something called the Writing on the Wall as Enterprise, where we're creating a brand of businesses run by formerly incarcerated people around the world that are all branded and decked out in the Writing on the Wall artwork, so that they're therefore supporting both reintegration and putting money in people's pockets who are coming home from prison, but also, again, creating culture change by raising awareness about this issue, through the branding. So we're hoping that we'll be able to roll that out in a more robust fashion in 2025, 2026. So those are some of the things that we've got cooking.
It's fantastic. It's a lot of great stuff going on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So we'll sign off here as we move towards the end. Is there anything you wanted to share with folks about kind of what you're up to, or how to find what you're working on, or how to contact or reach out to INN?
So we are on all the platforms, and we welcome followers on our Instagram that's at Incarceration Nations. Our website is incarcerationnationsnetwork.org. It's currently going through some construction. It's up, but there's some things that are being edited there. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Facebook. Our monthly newsletter is very awesome, so you can sign up for that on our website. We've got a YouTube channel. And Critical Mass, the group I mentioned from Trinidad, they have a YouTube channel. My personal Instagram is my name, Baz Dreisinger. So we're all over the place, and we welcome people to join us and spread the word. And I mentioned the docuseries. We welcome screenings in classrooms, wherever, and we're happy to collaborate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everybody for listening. You can find us here on the John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel, our website, our social media. We will be back tomorrow with one more great guest to wrap up the week. But until then, Baz, thanks for coming on and spending some time with us. And Rob, thanks for jumping in and joining us today.
Thanks, Dr. Baz.
Thank you.